the first few points made in my summaries to make it simple for the audience who may have looked at this. So I say that the book begins with an introductory chapter laying out the philosophical approach, its theory of science. This was a concept, the theory of science, Wissenschaftslehre, that Fichte introduced in the 17th century, but which Andy Georgi took up with a more simple word, approach, and it was something that Lester Ambry translated as theory of science. It's also been rendered as science of knowledge. But the theory of science, the metapsychology that underlies what we do, I felt was imperative to impart to the reader at the very outset. So it's in this first chapter that I try to introduce the ontological foundations, such as Dan Sahavi was suggesting in his PowerPoint this morning. What are some of the ontological assumptions of freedom versus determinism, of choice versus contingencies of reinforcement? How can I introduce the reader who's never studied phenomenology to what intentionality is, and to breathe life into it? So I tried to fill the book with many examples so that the reader could immediately relate these concepts to their own experience, and in fact, to build the concepts out of life world experiences. So among the things that I would say are I made the effort to communicate was that it was a reflective method defined by the mode in which we reflect on the data, but not the data itself. Again, Heidegger's statement that the term phenomenology merely defines the how with which what we are studying is to be approached and analyzed. So what makes the method distinctively phenomenological is not that it contains first-person self-report data, but rather that it's based upon Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty's collective efforts at communicating what are we doing when we're reflecting on our life world experiences, and what is it that we're leading ourselves back to, that namely intentionality and its components of temporality, sociality, embodiment, worldhood, etc. In the first chapter, I tried to make this come alive by using Sartre, who many of you who've read Being and Nothingness will know that much of the book is a propedeutic to his existential psychoanalysis. On page 735, he's got a line and he says, "This is the point where ontology must stop. Its final formulations become the first principles of an existential psychoanalysis or a phenomenological psychology." That again is what Dan Sahavi was saying this morning. We need to build our phenomenological approach on being steeped in the literature and language of phenomenology. So I used Sartre's purifying reflection versus impure reflection as another way of casting Dilthey's understanding versus explanation. And I used Schutz's in order to motives versus because motives as a more palpable introductory way of trying to make this become more clear to the first-time reader. After this, I gave a summary of the key features of the phenomenological method. And I want to say here as a pause, in the first chapter, I made a point to name at least 50 other researchers and developers of the method. 2 minutes? Okay, yeah. I've got, okay. The developers of the method were the folks from Duquesne, Andy, Connie Fisher, Bill Fisher, Ralph von Eckertsberg, and then my colleagues, Fred Wirtz, Jim Morley, Chris Anstus. This is a collective effort, and I was trying to create a synthesis of this. So I used the language of Husserl primarily to present the method, and then drawing upon Heidegger's distinction of the structure of inquiry, made a distinction between the phenomenon and the situation that reveals it. The experiential approach to data collection was built largely upon von Eckertsberg's essay on experiential methodology, cooperative dialogue, deep listening, the empathic regard of the researcher that kind of pulls from the participant meanings and statements that would not otherwise come forth. And then finally, the steps of the method in doing an analysis of the data and then a synthesis of the findings into individual and general structural statements. That's a thumbnail sketch, and I'll hand it over now to my discussants.
Thank you, Scott. Much appreciated, and thanks for ending on time. So we're next going to turn over to Magnus Englander in Sweden, and he'll have 10 minutes, and then we'll have Mark Applebaum in San Francisco, who will respond for 10 minutes. Then we'll open it up for question and answer. Magnus, take it away.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks for inviting me to be a commentary on this book by Scott Churchill. And I'm gonna sort of like read something that I prepared, which is also a draft of a, hopefully a book review that will, you know, come out one day. Scott Churchill's book on existential phenomenological research, or EPR, as the acronym is here, is probably, I would say, the most pedagogical and straightforward book on qualitative phenomenological research method that I have come across thus far. And I have taught this methodology for about 20 years now. So I would say that this is the best I've seen so far. And I would say that students and novel researchers here will praise this text. And the originality of this work is not just that Churchill manages to disclose the unity between the existential and the phenomenological approaches, but that he also provides the well-versed reader with evidence that some of the differences of these two approaches have lately been way overstated. So this book will find its way, I think, to the required reading list for both undergraduate and graduate level students for many years to come. And Churchill has also been able to preserve the unique prose, I would say, reminiscent of the original volumes of the Duquesne Studies in Phenomenological Psychology, that is providing the often, you know, standardized writing style in the social sciences and psychology with a sense of philosophical depth and just the right amount of flair from the humanities. It is clear that Churchill knows the subject matter and has spent a lifetime teaching this methodology. It is also clear that Churchill has conducted his own research using this methodology, as well as having supervised research in which this method has been utilized. So there is some truth to the being a participant observer, so to speak, in this sense of having been there and doing this type of research also. And that comes through. Examples are everywhere to be found in this book, bringing the book to life for the students approaching this method for the first time. In fact, reading this book made me feel as if I was situated in Churchill's classroom at the University of Dallas. As a matter of fact, it is outright difficult to find anything to critique here about Churchill's book, which I probably should have found. But considering this positive overall impression that I got, it becomes, I would say, rather difficult to dig into something specific here. But nonetheless, as pedagogical oriented this book is as a step-by-step approach, I would say, to EPR, the book also has depth in terms of situating the method within the phenomenological theory of science. And I think that's one of the most important things here in a Schutzian sense then. The following here that I will probably not be able to finish is an attempt at taking a closer look then at how the required existential phenomenological attitude, I would say, is continuously present in each and every chapter. So I will realize that I already used half my time, so I will focus on the first chapter because I think that's key. The first chapter is about the approach, and the approach sort of runs through all the chapters, and it's sort of like it outlines the theory of science that grounds EPR. And the well-versed reader in qualitative phenomenological research method instantly recognizes this as the original methodology developed at Duquesne University. Nevertheless, Churchill is not reiterating Amadeo Giorgi's research method here, but instead he returns to its broader roots at Duquesne University as found in both the existential and phenomenological tradition, just like he said in his introduction here. By including other developers, EPR becomes wide-ranging as a research movement, I would say. And also the name EPR, Existential Phenomenological Research, not focusing on the method, but more as a way of doing research. Giorgi's, of course, sense of approach and method is still of utter importance to EPR, but Churchill is also actively referring to the hermeneutically phenomenological tradition, notable to the work of Heidegger, of course, as we know him, that is as a guide to understand human intentionality as human existence and the clarification of human psychology. How approach relates to some general recommendation and criteria for qualitative research, as well as the APA task force, also introduces the book. So we can see this whole thing with the methodological integrity that comes through in just focusing on the approach. And that is one of the aspects that are interesting. And another part, I'll see if I can deviate from my my manuscript here to sort of like be spontaneous, I guess. And to say also that this type of existential phenomenological attitude that I can see here running through the whole book, and probably it's not explicit in the sense that Scott is saying anywhere that this is the existential phenomenological attitude, but that's what I get out of it. It's all the way through. It's beginning in the first chapter on the theory of science, and it's also within the practical chapters of writing up the report. I mean, it's all over the place. And that's really important because it grounds the whole work in that sense. And within this attitude, Churchill also includes the question about access. That is the phenomenology of empathy. And I think that's one of the most important aspects of just this method. Without an understanding of empathy and what provides the access to the other through the existential phenomenological attitude, then the understanding of the attitude would be incomplete. So Churchill accurately describes Husserl's view on empathy, for example, as a second person axis, helping the reader to understand that empathy is not a reflection, but instead what makes reflection about the other possible in the first place. And I think that's really clear, and that's fantastic. And Churchill also provides an account of intentionality, which is an important aspect here in the first chapter, and also runs throughout the book. And the epoche, of course, is introduced today, one of today's sort of like topics of interest. And but Churchill begins describing this technical methodological concept of the epoche, but wisely, not directly in relation to Husserl's project, but instead he begins with Schutz's understanding of this concept, and as a way to ground social sciences. I beg your pardon?
We're over time. Sorry.
Oh, so sorry. Yeah. All right. Yeah.
Take another minute.
Okay.
Jim, I don't think we've gone for 16 minutes total. But go ahead. After you're including your introduction. Yeah.
Yeah. And well, anyhow, the most important aspect of this book, it's practical, and it could help any students just get right into this area of research. And it also is supported by the methodological integrity of including the approach, and it's there in each and every chapter. And I think Scott did not just, take this book to the world of qualitative research, but he also took it all the way to APA. And I think that's an achievement. Thank you.
Excellent. Nice final comment as well. Mark, are you with us? Do you want to come enter?
Yeah, absolutely.
Conversation, and then we'll have time for a general discussion.
Yeah, thank you. So I was so excited to read the galleys of this book, and so happy to be part of this conversation today, because picking up on some of the themes Magnus has already mentioned, I think the great contribution of Scott's book, particularly for students, is how it conveys how to inhabit a phenomenological attitude, And so I'm going to quickly touch on a number of themes sort of falling under that rubric. The two biggest themes that stand out to me in reading the book are Scott's emphasis on relationality, the relationship between us as researchers and our research participants and data gathering, so the relational aspect of this, which is incredibly important. And then secondly, data analysis as a dynamic process rather than a lockstep or mechanical process. So these are the two themes that I think really serve students well, and I'm going to dig into those. a bit more. I think overall, what I want to say about Scott's presentation that I value so much is that he conveys the attitude of openness and discovery in the process of phenomenological research that sustains a creative tension between, on the one hand, procedural steps in data gathering and analysis that are well-grounded epistemologically, which is very important on the one hand, the form side of the equation, so to speak. And on the other hand, the freedom within that structure to engage in a discovery process that's open-ended and iterative, right? So I think that this book really conveys both sides of that dynamic equation and really serves students well in giving the flavor of what it is to again, inhabit the process of engaging in research. So having said that, a few words about empathy. I'll pick up again on that theme because it's so central here. And I think Scott does a great service in centering empathy within the discussion of how we do this work. The centering of this method on empathy really dispels any lingering sort of crypto-empirical flavors that might be in the background. And by empathy, we don't mean, for the students here, by empathizing or empathy, of course, we don't mean something like so-called professional empathy or clinical empathy, much less being nice to or agreeing with our participants. By empathy, phenomenologically speaking, in shorthand, I'm putting this in shorthand, we mean, as Magnus has written elsewhere, following the other's experience, following the meaningful experience of the other, okay? And in the book, Scott calls this kind of attending to the other deep listening, which I think is quite a good expression. To engage in that requires one as a researcher to set aside one's own self-absorbed or self-concerned perspective and to place one's attention on the other as a fellow human. So this again, tremendously important, I think, for the empathy piece is an important starting point. And all of this relies on our already inhabiting the assumption that we already inhabit a shared intersubjective world, a shared meaningful world that's so fundamental to the tradition that we're working in, or an interhuman world, to bring Martin Buber term into it. So Scott calls this empathizing empathic dwelling, or staying with the other in the process of research, staying with the other. Another really useful expression. For Scott in this book, the interview is an event that he says, quote, is mediated by our shared embodiment, unquote. So you hear right away that intercorporeality, in Merleau-Ponty's terms, is central to this approach, and I think that's quite important. And Scott writes, quote, we bring our whole body with us in our encounter with the data, unquote. Priceless, really important, again, as priming students for the lived experience of researching, right? And also for those of you who are in philosophy already, this references all the layers of the human being. So it reminds us that we're talking about, in Husserlian terms, the pre-reflective layers as well as the reflective layers. We bring our whole self to the research process to the greatest degree possible. And this is also a good antidote to what I would argue is a misconception of the phenomenological tradition, whether it's in philosophy or psychology, as being primarily concerned with cognitive meanings, primarily or even exclusively concerned with cognitive meanings. I think that what Scott's doing in this book clearly broadens that in a way that's true to the tradition, that we are as interested in affective, embodied meaning as reflective, expressed meaning, verbal meaning, right? Which also points to the fact that our data, what's given to us, is not only the words on a page, but the whole delivery of that narrative to us in the interview as a lived experience. So I think, to me, all of that is packed into the way in which Scott is conveying the approach. There really is so much I want to touch on here, so I get that I'm racing to do so here. Scott emphasizes that a phenomenon, a psychological phenomenon, is, quote, not understood as an event in itself, but rather as something that occurs for someone, unquote. Okay, so he's emphasizing that the phenomenon is situated within the particularities of that person's life who's sitting in front of you. Again, super important, and I think a good corrective to, again, what I would consider a misunderstanding of the tradition that would lead us to believe that we're interested only in the phenomenon, not in the person. I think that's unsupportable if we're true to the phenomenological tradition. It has to be both, because the phenomenon, if it's to be meaningful, is meaningful because it's immanent in the lived experience of that person who's sitting in front of us in the interview. Okay. So we're tacking back and forth between these levels as phenomenological psychologists. In terms of data analysis, I think the discussion of data analysis is also really helpful. Scott writes that he encourages students to adopt, quote, informality when writing down one's psychological impressions of what's being revealed in the data, unquote. And he reminds us that these notes that we write in the process of doing research are not intended to be thought of as final statements of analysis, but represent approximations along the way. So this is a very freeing way of envisioning and the research process itself. Also, by the way, like for you readers of Husserl, it mirrors perfectly Husserl's vision of science, which is an endless series of approximations, right? That's never fulfilled in finality, but that's what makes it scientific. That's what makes it scientific, yeah? Couldn't leave the Husserl out of that. Mm-hmm. Likewise, when Scott describes steps in the research process, I think he does a really good job in this book at valuing the steps themselves in the process and their foundation, their epistemological foundation, as I mentioned earlier, but also he places emphasis, Scott does, on the fluidity of inhabiting those steps. And he says, quote, one can find oneself inadvertently shifting between ideographic and nomothetic layers of analysis, unquote. And he mentions shifting moments in the researcher's experience, intermingling possibilities of reflective experience that can even occur simultaneously, rather than as steps, stages, or levels of analysis.
2 minutes, Mark, sorry.
Yeah, great, thanks. So again, this is the most, I think, inviting way into an approach like this, because you both get the rigor on the one hand and the need for a solid epistemological foundation, and the encouragement to inhabit that structure in a spontaneous way as much as possible as you gain comfort with it. So again, I'm really actually looking forward to using this text next year myself in courses, and I'll pause there.
Wow. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Magnus. Really helpful, very interesting, and definitely a great pitch for a text I think that many people were probably looking for a very long time. Scott, do you want to take a couple of minutes and respond, and then we'll ask people to send their questions to our Ask a Question person. You can drop down.
Sure,
Scott?
sure. Well, first of all, I'm really, really humbled by your collective feedback here. I know each of you as friends, colleagues, and especially as scholars who are well-read in the literature. So your feelings and approval of what I was doing during the pandemic makes the whole thing seem worthwhile, because I almost walked away from it at one point when I got back the first draft with 60% strike-throughs by the series editors. But I stuck with it, thinking of Georgie and the project. Something that you brought up, I think with Mark, about the focus on the person as well as the phenomenon, and I appreciate your underlining that. What I didn't say during the introduction, but what I say in the first couple of paragraphs of the book, is that when I introduce both Husserl and Heidegger, is to say that there are some kinds of phenomena that we study, like kinds of emotions, for example, such as Sartre does in his book on emotions, that lend themselves really obviously to employment of the eidetic method, the reflection on the eidos, the underlying unity of sense. And of course, there's eidetic reflection going on even in the study of the individual. I don't want to imply that it wouldn't be, but that's a more obvious place that we apply the Husserlian eidetic intuition. But there's another kind of approach in phenomenology that I learned from Heidegger and from reading his 1923 lecture course, Ontology, the Hermeneutics of Facticity. And I was chatting with Jim and Athena about this last week, that one of the interesting things about that is that Heidegger points out the expression hermeneutics of facticity, which sounds like the objective genitive, taking facticity as the object of my hermeneutics. Heidegger says more important is the subjective or possessive genitive, which would mean facticity's own self-interpretation, each individual factical life's own struggle. And I remember thinking about this when I was working on my anti-torture resolution for the APA, when I thought about those detainees, alone, forlorn, and wondering, why am I here? Why is this happening to me? Or when you break a leg or hurt a shoulder and you say, you know, what does this mean? What's the impact on my life? When you break up with someone, when you're growing, when you're going through developmental periods, when you're about to retire, there's all these idiographic phenomena that are not just particular, but even peculiar. And Heidegger celebrates that. He even used the German Je-Weiligkeit, with the J-E is just a modal flavor, but it emphasizes the peculiar way that we while our time. And that the real aim of philosophy for Heidegger, following Aristotle, was to study the Je-Weiligkeit, the individual peculiar way that we while our time, and that we try to struggle to understand what's happening to ourselves. So that when I had students, like recently, there's someone I think still on the webinar now, Stephanie Ladzima from my senior class last year, studying women's menstruation and problematic menstruation, another student studying miscarriage, another student studying immigrant humiliation. In each case, we found that the data wasn't a study of miscarriage or menstruation or humiliation. It was a study of the coming to terms, quite literally. In the words of the participants, we were getting their struggle to interpret, to understand, to make sense of what they were enduring, of what they were undergoing. And it's this individual idiographic level of phenomenology where it really comes alive, especially to the student. And then the next task is to try to take it to the more general level. How can we find in the individual findings take-homes that we bring with us when we encounter anyone else who may be having a similar experience? But there's this tension then between the empirical or the individual, the idiographic, and the eidetic, the more nomothetic. And I think phenomenology needs to maintain its addressing both levels. And even Merleau-Ponty makes that his point in the Phenomenology and the Sciences of Man, that you can't do eidetic phenomenology without passing through the empirical level of instances. And then you bring those ideas back to enrich your next understanding of psychological life. So the yin and the yang, the dialectics of the individual and the general, are all contained in this existential phenomenological method. And I really appreciate you getting that. So
maybe we can open it up to some questions. The first question, which I'll embellish a little bit, is could you give us any information about buying the book? When is it out? How much will it cost? And when will you be on Oprah to discuss it?
Well, the good news is that APA, being a nonprofit, is pricing this at $19, and they're pricing it for APA members at $15. Number two, because they don't have to pay property taxes on their backstock, they'll keep it in print. So most APA books remain in print for 2-3 decades. So it'll have, fortunately, some longevity. 3, they're really promoting the series of 12 books that are all called Essentials of, and then the name of the method. My title was given to me by the series editors. They wanted a method with an acronym, such as in their own. So it'll be released officially on August 10th, but it'll be available about a month before that. It'll be ready for fall class adoptions, and it'll be available, I'm sure, on Amazon as well. But if you have a membership or student membership with the APA, it'll be $15. It'll be a 100-page book.
Great. One question, so this isn't I didn't raise this question, but it's of interest to me, is how would you see phenomenology being applied, or let's say in dialogue with Freudian or Lacanian psychoanalysis?
Good question. I am not as conversant with the Lacanian approach, though I have many colleagues who are, but I very much appreciate the Freudian tradition. And I have one paragraph in the book, I had to cut it down, but because Freud and Husserl both studied under Franz Brentano, each of them was looking for intentionality. And Freud, in his case of Dora, is a good place to look, where he talks about the meaning. Then he says that is the motive. In other words, the intention of the symptom. So Freudian psychoanalysis began with a study of intentionality. In fact, if you read his studies on hysteria, everywhere that the word repression occurs, it's preceded by the adjective intentional. So along those lines, Merleau-Ponty's observation that it's not just the case that phenomenology and psychoanalysis are parallel disciplines. He says it's better than that. They are both aiming at the same latency in human experience. So I make a point to say that what we're doing, I even borrow the expression from Theodore Reich, listening with the third ear. That's why I talk about deep listening. And that's why I use Heidegger's notion of hearkening, where we're not just listening for surface level descriptions, but we're trying to get to a latent level that even the actor might not originally be reflectively present to. And even Schutz takes us in that direction, that when we look in retrospect, we identify the because motives, but when the actor is in the living moment of their action, that's when the in order to motives become present. And my friend and colleague here, Chris Anstous, did his dissertation on chess playing and decision-making and cognition, and he used a think aloud method precisely to capture the action of it. So in any case, back to the psychoanalysis, the latent intentionalities are very much the same kind of thing that Freud was going after. And I would suspect that a Lacanian could dialogue with that as well.
Thank you. Another question, is there a prerequisite for the ability to empathize with someone, namely self-compassion? In other words, is it possible to do existential phenomenological research without caring first for oneself? I ask this especially because self-care and self-compassion aren't always promoted by the common university discourses on research and productivity.
Boy, that's an excellent question and comment. I think of empathy as a natural, God-given aptitude, capacity, something that we're born with the potential for, something that's called out in us by our mothering ones, whether that's our biological mother or someone else, that in the mother-infant relationship, the first moments of what Theodore Lips called Einfühlung, the feeling of one's way in to the other's body, and the mimicry on my face of the facial expression that's looking at me, where I literally internalize the other whom I'm identifying with. I think of this early established empathy and maternal infant bond as the foundation for all later intersubjectivity in life. And that the researcher needs to learn how to tap into this already there method of understanding the other. Sometimes I've used the analogy of Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, when she's told by the good witch that, look down, you're wearing those red shoes. You've always had the ability to go home. Well, we've always had the ability to empathize with the other, but we do have to have a compassionate side of ourselves that has been nurtured, shepherded throughout our life. And I think, of course, self-care is certainly a significant portion of that.
Thank you. We have, I think, a few minutes if anybody else would like to send a question in. Unless Magnus or Mark wanted to add something maybe in response to Scott's response. Okay, here's a question. How might the book help us with, sorry, just lost it. How might the book help us I assume, researchers with research participants who are not so reflective participants?
Yeah, that's a challenge. We actually faced that this year, where one of my students was wanting to study the police officer's experience of being videotaped by the public. And we knew that we were not going to get a long protocol description to start with, though it's always good to give the prompt to the person to begin to write down their thoughts and reflections. This is where the interview technique of an empathic presence becomes very important. I can tell you, for example, I have colleagues in Scandinavia studying spinal cord injury. And these participants are not all that verbal, nor are their families in trying to disclose the world of spinal cord injury. And what I find is that my Danish colleagues and Swedish and Norwegian in the nursing profession, the Swedes call themselves caring scientists. They really embody that Heideggerian care, that the Fürsorge, the solicitude, and the leaping ahead, the vorausspringen, the Fürsorge, the not intrusive, but the opening up a space, a safe space within the other can disclose themselves. When you find yourself with a participant that doesn't come forth right away with the statements that you want, you may not have established rapport first. That's one of the first things you learn in psychological assessment, is the importance of establishing a rapport. What the nurses do is they manage to embody in their caring presence a safe space that enables and pulls forth from their research participants words and statements that would not have just been written down on paper. And they also learn to listen with a third ear when someone speaks to them, and it may even say something opposite of what they mean, such as when the husband of a spinal cord injured patient says, "It's okay, this is the way it has to be." But the person, the nurse, hears in the Danish colloquialism that was used in saying that he really meant the opposite of what he was saying explicitly. And in her hearing that and resonating with that, she was able to gently push him more in the direction of disclosing what the real truth of the matter was. So whether it's a participant not willing to come forth, or someone who, for the reasons of the deep challenges that they're facing, and whether it's facing death or spinal cord injury, cancer, you need to have someone who's like a midwife to your own giving birth to your self-understanding, that Heideggerian self-Verständnis of the individual. It's done sometimes best in dialogue, what von Eckartsburg called cooperative dialogue. And the way of doing that, you need training in therapy sometimes, how to be a therapeutic presence. Carl Rogers' client-centered therapy is good there. Remy Quant, I think the Dutch phenomenologist, Encounter, great book on this.
Maybe one last question. In some cases, research participants narrate the memory of their experience instead of the exact experience itself. In such cases, do we treat the memory differently from the memory of the experience differently from the experience, or is the memory integral to the experience?
Wow, I've dealt with this before. It's a great question. I'm trying to think how to give a condensed answer, because there is a difference between the experiences lived and the experiences remembered, especially when they're emotional experiences, especially when the person in getting past a difficult experience has created a narrative for themselves that makes their past integratable into their present. And we have to be sensitive to the fact that we don't want to blow the whistle on what might be a rationalization or an intellectualization on the part of the person, or even just a storying of their life that helps them move beyond the moment that it refers back to. On the other hand, there may be situations that are not something so dreadful, such as studies of sexual experiences that we did 20, 30 years ago. It was some students interested in sexual compliance in females. This was the topic that one of my students wanted to study. And she asked them to describe the experience where the guy she was with wanted to go further than they did, and why why did you stop, and why did you not, she would put them in a situation of having to defend why they went along with things. And in retrospect, what we got were all of these self-justifying explanations or Sartrean excuses that were self-deceptive. So I wrote an article called Seeing Through Self-Deception in Narrative Reports, Finding Methodological Virtue in Problematic Data, because what we found was that the intention, the need to disown responsibility in the remembering of the experience was probably a component of how the person lived self-deceptively through the experience of disowning their agency. So that the disowning of agency and the telling of the story later was an indicator of a probable disowning in the process originally. This is just two examples. Wow.
Well, thank you for that, Scott. I mean, sorry, I had a little laugh because it reminded me of that scene every time I have to read the woman and the man at the table. We know what she really wants. It gets complicated to read things like that these days. I did unmute Mark and Magnus in case you wanted to. I know we're just out of time, but if there's any kind of sort of concluding remarks you'd like to make before we go to lunch, we'd appreciate them.
Well, I can quickly say that one aspect that we haven't really brought up, and I think that's great because it also runs through the whole book, is the distinction, or actually not the distinction, but the reversibility or figure ground relation between the phenomenon and the situation, which Scott is always emphasizing, and it's there all the way through also. So that's something that we haven't really brought up, but I just wanted to mention that because I didn't have time to cover it.
I can address it very briefly, and that is to say that for the most part, when we read phenomenological methodologies, we say that our phenomenon is some lived experience. We always go back to Husserl's Erlebnis usually. And that's what we mean is moments in the stream of life. And we focus on that lived experience, and we want to do a description of that lived experience. But I take that description as the starting point, not the final goal, because I find that any lived experience can have a multitude of psychological phenomena buried within them. And the question is, which is your thesis or your research project going to be on? When I was studying, I wanted to study the phenomenon of clinical intuition, and I located it. We used to say in Duquesne, well, we need a vehicle for this study. So we located it in psychological assessment. But right away, my topic got referred to by the faculty and by my peers as, oh, he's the guy doing assessment. That's his phenomenon. And one of my advisors said, yeah, your research question is, how does an assessment happen? Well, after 2 years of being lost in the data, I went to talk to one of my readers, Tony Barton, who was a clinician. And he read my data and he said, wow, you've got a dozen dissertation topics in here. What do you want to study? And then I told him, the meaning constituting activities of the clinician. I wanted to do a constitutive phenomenology within the natural attitude of the clinician, just what Barbara talked about today. But the faculty weren't hip to the idea of constitutive phenomenology. But I finally got it through. Another friend wanted to study intercorporeality, and he picked dance. And everyone said, oh, he's doing the dissertation on dance. But dance was the situation that had within it the phenomenon of intercorporeality, which he gave birth to as the coherence of gestures in improvisational dance. So what I learned from those two experiences early on is that we have the situations that we pick to reveal our phenomena, and then we have the phenomena, almost like the statue in the marble that Michelangelo sees. There's the phenomenon waiting to be pulled out, and we need to have good research questions that we pose to the data to pull those phenomena out. So I make the distinction between the phenomenon and the situation that reveals it, and that the data that describes that lived experience, which is the situation, can be plumbed for a number of different research interests, and you have to decide what that interest is. And Georgie kind of alluded to this in his 1975 article in the Second Duquesne Studies, where he talked about the structure and the style of learning, but people didn't pay close enough attention to that.
Well, thank you for that session, Mark, Magnus, and Scott.
Thank you, Athena.
I mean, really, thank
Thanks.
you.